July 20th, 1969. 600 million people around the world gathered around television sets, radios, and public screens to witness something that had never happened before in human history. Two men in bulky white spacesuits stepped onto the surface of another world. Neil Armstrong's words echoed across the planet. That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. It was supposed to be humanity's greatest achievement, a moment of unity and wonder that transcended borders and politics. But today, more than 50 years later, millions of people believe it never happened at all. Poll after poll shows that somewhere between 5 and 10% of Americans think the moon landing was an elaborate hoax, a Hollywood production designed to fool the world. In some countries, that number is even higher. This isn't just fringe conspiracy theory anymore, it's mainstream doubt, and it's growing. So here's the question we're really asking today. Was the Apollo moon landing completely faked, or is something else going on here? Because as we're going to discover, the truth is far more complex and far more disturbing than either the skeptics or the believers want to admit. Before we dive into flags and shadows and radiation belts, we need to understand why this conspiracy theory exists in the first place. Because people don't just wake up one day and decide to doubt one of the most documented events in history. There's a reason millions of people look at the moon landing footage and think, I don't believe that. And that reason has nothing to do with the moon itself. It has everything to do with trust, or more specifically, the complete collapse of trust in American institutions during the exact same era when Apollo was happening. Let's rewind to the 1960s and early 1970s. This was not a time when Americans blindly trusted their government. This was an era of systematic deception on a scale that's hard to comprehend today. In 1964, the Gulf of Tonkin incident gave the United States justification to massively escalate the Vietnam War. The government claimed that North Vietnamese forces had attacked American destroyers in international waters, not once but twice. Congress passed the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, essentially giving President Johnson a blank check to wage war. 58,000 Americans died in that war. Millions of Vietnamese died. And years later, declassified documents revealed that the second attack, the one that really pushed us into full-scale war, never actually happened. It was fabricated. The government lied to start a war. Then came the Pentagon Papers in 1971. Daniel Ellsberg, a military analyst, leaked 7,000 pages of classified documents showing that the US government had been systematically lying to the American public about Vietnam for years. They knew the war was unwinnable. They knew the casualty figures were wrong. They knew they were sending young men to die in a conflict they couldn't win, and they lied about it repeatedly. When the Pentagon Papers were published, it shattered whatever remaining trust Americans had in their government's honesty. But it didn't stop there. In 1972, just 3 years after the moon landing, the Watergate scandal exploded into public consciousness. The President of the United States had ordered a break-in at the Democratic National Committee headquarters. Then he orchestrated a massive cover-up involving the FBI, the CIA, and the Justice Department. The most powerful man in America was caught red-handed committing crimes and lying to cover them up. Richard Nixon resigned in disgrace in 1974, becoming the first president to do so. The message was clear. Even the highest levels of government will lie, cheat, and break the law when it suits them. And then the deeper, darker revelations started coming out. In 1975, the Church Committee investigations revealed COINTELPRO, a series of illegal FBI operations to spy on, infiltrate, and sabotage civil rights, groups, anti-war activists, and political organizations. They sent fake letters to break up marriages. They encouraged violence between rival groups. They tried to blackmail Martin Luther King Jr. into committing suicide. The FBI, The organization supposed to uphold the law was running domestic terrorism operations against American citizens. That same year, the world learned about MK Ultra. For over 20 years, the CIA had been running mind control experiments on American citizens without their knowledge or consent. They dosed people with LSD. They conducted psychological torture experiments. They used universities, hospitals, and prisons as testing grounds. When they realized they were about to be exposed, they destroyed most of the evidence. What we know about MK Ultra is only the tip of the iceberg because they burned the rest of the files. Then there was the Tuskegee syphilis study, which ran from 1932 to 1972, right through the Apollo era. The US Public Health Service told 600 black men in Alabama that they were receiving free health care. In reality, researchers were studying what happens when syphilis goes untreated. Even after penicillin became the standard cure in 1947, they let these men suffer, go blind, lose their minds, and die, all in the name of science, for 40 years. So imagine you're an American citizen in 1975. In just the last few years, you've learned that your government lied to start a war that killed 58,000 Americans. Your president was a criminal who had to resign. The CIA was drugging citizens in illegal experiments. The FBI was running domestic terror operations. The Public Health Service conducted unethical experiments on black Americans for 4 decades. Every major institution, from the White House to the CIA, to the FBI, to the military, to public health agencies, had been caught lying, committing crimes, and covering up their actions. And you're supposed to just trust that everything they told you about the moon landing in 1969 was 100% truthful? This is why the conspiracy theory exists. Not because the evidence is compelling, but because the institution making the claim had systematically destroyed its own credibility. When someone lies to you over and over again, when they get caught in massive deceptions repeatedly, why would you believe them when they tell you something that sounds impossible? That's the foundation of moon landing skepticism. It's not really about the moon at all. It's about trust and the complete collapse of that trust during the exact era when Apollo happened. Now let's get into the actual claims. The most famous piece of evidence that conspiracy theorists point to is the American flag. You've seen the footage, everyone has. The flag appears to wave and ripple as if there's a breeze blowing across it. But here's the problem. There's no atmosphere on the moon. No air, no wind, nothing to make a flag move. So how is it waving? Conspiracy theorists say it's obvious proof that this was filmed on a soundstage with fans or air conditioning creating the movement. The flag is moving because there's air in the room, they claim, which means it can't be on the moon. But hold on, because the actual explanation is both simpler and more interesting than that. NASA engineers weren't stupid. They knew that without an atmosphere, a regular flag would just hang limply against the pole, which would look absolutely terrible on camera and defeat the entire symbolic purpose of planting the American flag on the moon. So they designed the flag with a horizontal rod along the top edge to hold it extended perpendicular to the vertical pole. If you look closely at the footage, you can actually see this L-shaped bracket at the top of the flag. When the astronauts twisted the flagpole into the lunar soil, they had to rotate the entire flag structure to get it planted properly. That twisting motion caused the flag to move. And here's where the physics gets really interesting and actually proves this couldn't have been filmed on Earth. On Earth, when you move a flag, air resistance stops the motion almost immediately. The flag might flutter for a second, but then it goes still because air is pushing against it from all directions, dampening the movement. On the moon, there's no air resistance whatsoever, so when the astronauts moved that flagpole, whether by planting it, adjusting it, or even just walking past it and brushing against it, the flag started moving and kept moving for an extended period. The fabric oscillated back and forth because there was absolutely nothing to stop it. This is basic Newtonian physics, the concept of inertia. An object in motion stays in motion unless acted upon by an external force. On the Moon, there's no air to provide that dampening force. The only thing that eventually stops the flag from moving is the internal friction within the fabric itself, which takes much longer than air resistance would. You can actually test this principle yourself. Wave a flag in normal air and watch how quickly it stops moving, usually within a second or two. Now wave it underwater and you'll notice the movement continues much longer because water provides less resistance than air, though it's still there providing some dampening effect. The Moon is like waving a flag in a perfect vacuum where the movement continues for an extended period until the fabric's own properties eventually dampen it. Some conspiracy theorists also point to the wrinkles in the flag as evidence that it was recently unfolded on a set. And they're actually correct that it was recently unfolded, but that doesn't prove what they think it does. The flag was stored in a tube attached to the side of the lunar module during the 3-day journey to the Moon. When the astronauts deployed it on the surface, it naturally had wrinkles from being compressed during transit. Those wrinkles never smoothed out because once again there's no air to help the fabric relax and flatten. So the flag waving isn't proof of a hoax at all. If anything, the way the flag moves in the footage, with that extended oscillation and lack of quick dampening, is actually proof that it was filmed in an airless environment. If this had been faked on a soundstage on Earth, the flag would have moved differently, with that characteristic quick dampening that air provides. The conspiracy theorists got the observation right, but the conclusion completely backward. The second major visual argument that conspiracy theorists love to bring up is the missing stars. Look at any photograph taken on the lunar surface and you'll notice something strange. The sky is completely black. You can see the astronauts clearly. The lunar module is visible. The lunar surface is bright and detailed, but the sky behind everything is just solid black. No stars. No planets, nothing. And this does seem weird when you first think about it. There's no atmosphere on the Moon to block starlight or create light pollution. The sky should be absolutely packed with stars, more than you could ever see from Earth. Some conspiracy theorists claim you should be able to see thousands of stars in these photos, and the fact that you can't means the photos were taken on a soundstage with a simple black backdrop. It seems like a compelling argument until you understand how cameras actually work. This isn't a space problem or a conspiracy, it's a photography problem, and it's something that every photographer understands. Cameras work by allowing light to hit film or a digital sensor for a specific amount of time, which is called exposure time or shutter speed. If you're photographing something very bright, like a sunlit landscape, or a person standing in direct sunlight, you need a very short exposure time, maybe 1/250th of a second or even faster. If you don't use a short exposure, the bright objects will be overexposed, washed out, and you'll lose all detail. On the other hand, if you're photographing something dim, like stars in the night sky, you need a very long exposure time, possibly several seconds or even longer. Without enough exposure time, not enough light reaches the sensor and you see nothing but blackness. Here's the critical point. You cannot photograph both very bright objects and very dim objects in the same frame with the same camera settings. You have to choose one or the other. The lunar surface is incredibly bright because it's being hit by direct, unfiltered sunlight with no atmosphere to diffuse it. The astronauts' spacesuits are bright white, specifically designed to reflect heat in the harsh lunar environment. The lunar module is made of highly reflective metallic materials. All of these objects are extremely bright, so NASA's cameras were set with short exposure times to properly capture these bright objects without overexposing them. At those exposure settings, stars, which are incredibly Far away and relatively dim by comparison simply don't register on the film. Not enough photons from those distant stars hit the film in that fraction of a second to create a visible image. You can actually test this exact phenomenon right now with your phone. Go outside at night in any area with artificial lighting, like a street with streetlights or a building with outdoor lights. Take a photo of one of those bright lights. The light itself will be perfectly visible in your photo, clear and detailed, but you won't see any stars in the sky. Now switch your phone camera to night mode or professional mode, where you can manually adjust the exposure time. Increase the exposure to several seconds. Suddenly, stars will appear in your photo. But now all the bright objects, those streetlights and buildings, will be completely blown out, overexposed, with no detail left. This is the exact same problem NASA faced on the Moon. The Apollo missions used Hasselblad 500 EL cameras with 70mm film, and the film they used had a fixed sensitivity to light called ISO or ASA rating. This wasn't digital photography where you can adjust settings instantly. They had to commit to specific film stock designed for the bright lunar environment. If NASA had wanted to photograph stars from the Moon, they would have needed much longer exposure times, different film with higher light sensitivity. The astronauts would have to remain perfectly still, which is no easy task in a bulky spacesuit, and they would have needed tripods and timer setups. And even if they did all that, the bright lunar surface and spacesuits and equipment would be completely overexposed and washed out in those photos. Here's something interesting that conspiracy theorists don't mention. When astronauts took photos from orbit on the far side of the Moon, or during specific mission phases when they could use longer exposures away from bright surfaces, stars actually do appear in some images. But these are rare because the vast majority of mission photography was focused on documenting the lunar surface, equipment, experiments, and scientific activities, not on astrophotography. The irony of the missing stars argument is that if the Apollo photos had shown thousands of stars while also showing properly exposed astronauts and equipment, that would actually be suspicious. That would mean someone had gone to enormous lengths to composite multiple images together, or fake something that should be physically impossible with a single exposure. The fact that the stars are missing is exactly what you'd expect from authentic photographs taken in bright sunlight on the lunar surface with cameras set for those bright conditions. The conspiracy theorists saw something that looked wrong to them based on their everyday experience, but they didn't understand the technical photography reasons behind it. Once again, the evidence they think proves a hoax actually proves the opposite. The third major visual claim is about the shadows. In various Apollo photographs, conspiracy theorists point out that shadows appear to point in different directions, or some shadows seem longer than others, or shadows appear at odd angles that don't seem to make sense. They claim this proves there were multiple light sources, as if someone had set up studio lights at different positions on a film set to illuminate the scene. On the Moon, with only the sun as a light source, all shadows should be perfectly parallel, right? That's what conspiracy theorists argue, and if the shadows aren't parallel, it must mean artificial lighting was used. But this argument falls apart once you understand two things: uneven terrain and wide-angle lenses. Let's start with the sun being the only light source because that part is absolutely true. The sun was the only major light source during the Apollo missions. There were no studio lights. No other stars were bright enough to cast visible shadows. Earth's reflected light, while present, is far too weak to cast shadows. It was just the sun, period. So why do the shadows look weird in some photos? The answer is that the Moon's surface is not flat. It's covered in craters, hills, slopes, rocks, ridges, and undulations. Some areas rise up, others dip down. The surface is incredibly uneven. When sunlight hits uneven terrain, Shadows fall at angles that correspond to the contours of the surface beneath them. Think about this on Earth for a moment. Imagine two people standing on a hillside. One person is on a section of the hill that tilts toward the sun. The other person is on a section that tilts away from the sun. The sun is in the exact same position in the sky for both of them, but their shadows will fall at noticeably different angles because the ground beneath their feet is tilted in different directions. The same principle applies on the moon. In many of the most suspicious photos that conspiracy theorists point to, if you look carefully at the lunar surface, you can actually see the subtle slopes, ridges, and terrain variations that explain why shadows appear to point in different directions. There's also the issue of wide-angle lenses creating perspective distortion. The Apollo astronauts use cameras equipped with Zeiss lenses, including 60mm and 50mm focal lengths, which are considered moderately wide for the large format film they were using. Wide-angle lenses create perspective distortion where lines that are actually parallel in reality appear to converge in a photograph. This is why in photographs of railroad tracks, the rails seem to come together and meet in the distance, even though they're perfectly parallel. On the moon, shadows that are actually parallel in three-dimensional space can appear to point in different directions in a two-dimensional photograph due to this optical perspective effect. The shadows also vary in length depending on terrain. If one object is positioned on a slope that tilts toward the sun, its shadow will appear shorter. If another object is on a slope tilted away from the sun, its shadow will stretch out longer. This happens constantly on Earth. Go outside on any sunny day and look at shadows cast on hilly terrain, you'll see dramatic variation in shadow length and direction. There's also a subtle effect from reflected light that conspiracy theorists don't account for. The lunar module is highly reflective. Astronaut spacesuits are bright white and reflective, and even the lunar soil itself reflects a significant amount of sunlight. This creates faint secondary illumination that can slightly fill in shadows, making them appear less harsh than they would be in a pure vacuum with no reflected light at all. But this reflected light isn't bright enough to cast its own shadows, it just softens the existing shadows a bit. If you want to prove to yourself that shadows on uneven terrain look weird and appear to point in different directions, try this experiment. Set up two objects on a hillside on a sunny day and photograph them. You'll notice their shadows appear to point in different directions even though there's only one sun in the sky. Now set up the same two objects on perfectly flat ground like a parking lot or tennis court and photograph them again. The shadows will be parallel. The moon's surface isn't flat, it's covered in complex terrain, and that terrain explains the shadow variations completely. Once again, conspiracy theorists made an observation based on incorrect assumptions about what a flat surface should look like, when in reality, the evidence supports exactly what NASA claims happened. Now we're getting into what many conspiracy theorists consider their strongest technical argument, the Van Allen radiation belts. This is where the conspiracy theory moves beyond visual anomalies and gets into actual physics and radiation science. The Van Allen radiation belts are zones of intense radiation trapped by Earth's magnetic field, discovered by satellite measurements in 1958. They consist of high-energy protons and electrons that spiral along Earth's magnetic field lines. There are two main belts. The inner belt starts at about 1,000 kilometers altitude and extends to about 6,000 kilometers. The outer belt starts at roughly 13,000 kilometers and extends to 60,000 kilometers or more. The Moon is 384,000 kilometers away from Earth. To reach it, Apollo spacecraft had to pass through both radiation belts. Conspiracy theorists argue that this radiation would have been lethal to the astronauts, causing immediate radiation sickness or death. Therefore, they claim, astronauts never actually made the journey. Therefore, it must have been faked. This sounds like a damning argument until you look at the actual numbers and understand how radiation exposure really works. First, let's understand what radiation does to the human body. Radiation damages living tissue in two main ways: acute exposure and cumulative exposure. Acute exposure means receiving a massive dose of radiation in a short period of time, which can cause radiation sickness, organ failure, and death. This requires exposure to hundreds of REMs, or several sieverts, delivered in a matter of hours. Cumulative exposure means lower doses spread over time that increase cancer risk years or decades later. This is what happens to frequent flyers, nuclear power plant workers, and people who receive multiple medical X-rays over their lifetime. The Van Allen belts contain both types of radiation particles, but the critical factors are dose rate and exposure duration. Here's what people miss. Apollo didn't just fly straight through the thickest, most dangerous parts of the radiation belts and hang out there. NASA mission planners carefully plotted a trajectory that passed through the thinnest regions of both belts, where radiation intensity was lowest. They also crossed through as quickly as possible. The Apollo spacecraft traveled at roughly 25,000 miles per hour. At that velocity, transit through the radiation belts took less than 2 hours total, approximately 30 minutes through the inner belt and about an hour or so through the outer belt, depending on the specific trajectory. This is critical because radiation exposure is a function of both intensity and time. Even a high radiation environment becomes manageable if you pass through it quickly enough. The Apollo command module also wasn't just a thin aluminum can. It had an aluminum hull approximately 3 inches thick in most places, heat shield material made of ablative compounds, equipment and supplies stored throughout the cabin that provided additional shielding, and the spacecraft's own structure and systems positioned between the crew compartment and the radiation source. This wasn't lead-lined bunker-level protection, but it didn't need to be. Aluminum is actually quite effective at stopping lower energy radiation particles, and while it's less effective against very high energy particles, the exposure time was short enough that the total dose remained well below dangerous levels. NASA equipped astronauts with dosimeters, which are devices that measure radiation exposure. These were provided by independent laboratories and universities, not just NASA. After each mission, these dosimeters were analyzed by third-party contractors. The actual measurements showed that Apollo 11 astronauts received about 0.18 rads, or 1.8 millisieverts, during the entire mission, including launch, transit through the radiation belts, time on the lunar surface, return through the radiation belts, and splashdown. Most Apollo missions recorded total doses between 0.16 and 1.14 rads. For context, a chest X-ray delivers about 0.01 rads. A CT scan delivers about 1 to 2 rads. Radiation sickness symptoms begin to appear at around 50 to 100 rads received in a short time. A lethal dose is approximately 400 to 500 rads. The Apollo astronauts received less radiation during their entire moon mission than you'd receive from a single CT scan of your chest. But here's what's really interesting. The Van Allen belts weren't actually the biggest radiation risk. The real danger was solar particle events, which are sudden massive eruptions from the sun that spray high-energy protons and other particles across space. These solar flares can deliver lethal doses of radiation in minutes to anyone caught outside Earth's protective magnetosphere. If a major solar flare had occurred while astronauts were on the moon or in transit, the command module's aluminum shielding would not have been sufficient to protect them, and they likely would have received a lethal or near-lethal dose. NASA knew this was a risk. They carefully monitored solar activity before and during each mission, consulted with solar physicists, and scheduled missions during predicted low-activity periods in the sun's 11-year cycle. They got lucky. No, Major solar flares occurred during any of the Apollo missions. If one had happened, it could have been catastrophic. This was a known, calculated risk that NASA took, and they were fortunate that the sun remained relatively quiet during the Apollo program. If NASA had faked the moon landings, they would have needed to fake the radiation exposure data as well. But remember, the dosimeters were provided by independent labs, and the film badges were developed and analysed by third-party contractors who had no reason to lie for NASA. Those readings showed exactly what you'd expect from a fast transit through the radiation belts: low but measurable exposure. If the astronauts had stayed in low Earth orbit below the radiation belts, their exposure would have been nearly zero. If they'd spent more time in the belts or gone through denser regions, their exposure would have been much higher. The readings precisely match the trajectory and mission profile that NASA claims occurred. The lunar surface itself has no magnetic field and no atmosphere, so it's constantly exposed to cosmic radiation and solar wind. During the time astronauts spent on the surface, ranging from a few hours for Apollo 11 to about 3 days for later missions, they did receive additional radiation exposure, but again, well within safe limits for short-term exposure. The bigger concern would be long-term lunar habitation, which is why modern plans for moon bases include extensive radiation shielding built into habitat designs. The Van Allen radiation belts sound absolutely terrifying when you phrase it as deadly radiation zones surrounding Earth that would kill any human who passes through. But radiation isn't a video game where you enter a radiation zone and instantly die. It's about dose rate over time, and the Apollo missions managed both factors well enough to keep astronaut exposure below dangerous thresholds. This brings us to perhaps the most psychologically powerful argument for conspiracy theorists. If we landed on the moon 6 times between 1969 and 1972, why haven't we gone back? It's been over 50 years now. We have vastly better technology, better materials, better computers, better rockets, better everything. So why did we stop? It seems deeply suspicious to a lot of people. Conspiracy theorists say the answer is obvious. We stopped because it was fake from the beginning. We never actually figured out how to do it. We can't go back because we never went in the first place. But the real answer, while less exciting than a conspiracy, is actually more cynical and more revealing about how governments operate. The Apollo program cost approximately $25 billion in 1973 dollars. Adjusted for inflation, that's roughly $280 billion in today's money. To put that in perspective, that's more than NASA's entire annual budget today. That's more than the total cost of building and operating the International Space Station over its entire lifetime. That's about half the cost of the Manhattan Project that developed the atomic bomb. At the program's peak, NASA's budget represented 4.4% of the entire federal budget. Today, NASA gets about 0.5%. The moon landings were not a sustainable program. They were a sprint, not a marathon, and there was never any intention of making it sustainable. What economic reason was there to continue going to the moon? In the 1960s and 1970s, the answer was none. There's no oil on the moon. There are no precious metals that couldn't be obtained more easily on Earth. There was no strategic military advantage to maintaining a lunar presence. There was no profit motive whatsoever. Yes, we later discovered water ice at the lunar poles, and yes, there's helium-3 that could theoretically be used for fusion power someday, but in 1972, none of that mattered or was even known. Going to the moon was monumentally expensive, and staying there would have been even more expensive, and there was simply no economic justification for continuing. But the real reason we stopped going has nothing to do with economics. It has to do with politics. Apollo was never really about science or exploration. It was about beating the Soviet Union. Let me be absolutely clear about this. The space race was a Cold War proxy battle, a way for two superpowers with nuclear weapons to compete without actually going to war. It was about demonstrating technological superiority, ideological superiority, and ultimately about showing the world which political system, capitalism or communism, was more advanced. When President Kennedy announced in 1961 that America would land a man on the moon before the decade was out, that wasn't about exploration or advancing human knowledge. That was a direct response to Yuri Gagarin becoming the first human in space just weeks earlier. America was losing the space race badly. The Soviets had launched the first satellite with Sputnik. They'd sent the first animal to orbit, the first human to space, the first woman to space, the first spacewalk, the first probe to hit the moon, the first probe to soft land on the moon. They were dominating every category, and in the context of the Cold War, this was absolutely terrifying to American policymakers. Each Soviet space achievement was a propaganda victory that suggested Soviet technology and Soviet science and Soviet education and Soviet ideology were superior to America's. The moon landing was America's way of winning the space race decisively and undeniably. And it worked. After Apollo 11 successfully landed on the moon and returned safely, the political value of continuing the program plummeted immediately. America had proven its point. The space race was over, and America had won. There was no reason to keep spending enormous amounts of money on something that had already achieved its political objective. Public interest collapsed almost immediately as well. Apollo 11 had 600 million viewers worldwide. But by the time Apollo 13 launched in 1970, the one that almost ended in disaster when an oxygen tank exploded, television networks weren't even broadcasting the routine parts of the mission because nobody was watching. By Apollo 17, the final mission in 1972, public interest had almost completely evaporated. People had moved on. The Vietnam War was still raging and becoming increasingly unpopular. The economy was struggling with inflation and unemployment. Watergate was about to explode. Social problems in American cities were mounting. Nobody cared about collecting more moon rocks when there were so many problems on Earth demanding attention. Congress started asking the obvious question: why are we spending billions of dollars on moon missions when we have poverty, urban decay, crime, a failing war, and economic problems? The money that had been pouring into Apollo got redirected. Some went to the Space Shuttle program, which was sold as a more practical and reusable way to access space. Some went to social programs. Some went to other priorities. NASA's budget got slashed dramatically. Planned missions got cancelled. Apollo 18, 19, and 20 were all scrapped despite being fully planned and having hardware already built. The political will to continue was gone. Then the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, and the entire rationale for the space race, ideological competition between superpowers, vanished completely. There was no longer a rival superpower to compete against. No existential threat to American technological supremacy. Going back to the moon became a nice-to-have rather than a must-have, and governments don't fund nice-to-haves when there's no political benefit. So why are we talking about going back now with programs like Artemis? Because the geopolitical situation has changed again. China is landing rovers on the moon and has announced plans for a crewed lunar base. India successfully landed near the lunar South Pole. Private companies like SpaceX are developing lunar landers. Suddenly there's a new space race emerging, not with the Soviets but with China and private industry. And just like in the 1960s, it's not really about science. It's about power, prestige, and dominance. We stopped going to the moon for the same reason we stopped building Gothic cathedrals, or launching crusades, or doing any number of historical endeavors. Not because we forgot how, not because it was fake, but because the society that created them changed, the priorities shifted, and most importantly, the money ran out and the political value disappeared. Apollo was a specific moment in time, a unique confluence of fear, ambition, budget, and Cold War politics. When that moment ended, so did the moon program. Now here's the argument that, in my opinion, single-handedly destroys the hoax theory more than any other. If the moon landing was faked, why didn't the Soviet Union expose it? This is so simple yet so devastating to conspiracy theories that it's shocking it doesn't get more attention. Think about the context here. The space race was the most public, most humiliating competition of the entire Cold War. These were two superpowers with enough nuclear weapons to destroy human civilization, and instead of fighting directly, they competed in space to show the world which system was superior. The Soviet Union had dominated the early stages of the space race. First satellite, first animal in orbit, first human in space, first woman in space, first spacewalk, first probe to hit the moon, first soft landing on the moon. They were winning every milestone. And then suddenly, dramatically, America claimed the ultimate prize: humans walking on the moon and returning safely. This was a devastating propaganda defeat for the Soviet Union. It undermined everything they'd been saying about Soviet technological superiority. It made them look like they'd lost the most important competition of the Cold War. They had every possible reason, every motivation in the world to catch America in a lie if it was a lie. And they had the capability to do it. Soviet tracking stations monitored Apollo 11 from launch to splashdown. They detected and tracked the radio transmissions coming from the spacecraft. They tracked the spacecraft's trajectory through space. They listened to communications between the astronauts and mission control in Houston. Soviet radar installations in Crimea were specifically tasked with monitoring the mission and confirmed the spacecraft's position as it traveled toward the moon, orbited the moon, and returned to Earth. Independent astronomers in Soviet-aligned countries pointed their telescopes and radio receivers at the moon and tracked the mission. The Jodrell Bank Observatory in England, which had no particular loyalty to NASA and had actually tracked Soviet space missions in the past, also monitored Apollo and confirmed its signals were genuinely coming from the moon and not from somewhere on Earth. If the Soviets had detected anything suspicious, any evidence that the radio signals were coming from the wrong location, any inconsistencies in the spacecraft's trajectory, any technical impossibilities, any indication whatsoever that this was fake, they would have screamed it from every propaganda outlet on the planet. This would have been the greatest intelligence and propaganda coup in human history. They would have completely destroyed America's credibility on the world stage. They would have proven that capitalism was built on lies. They would have won the space race by default. But they said nothing, not during Apollo 11, not during any of the subsequent 5 missions, not in the years and decades afterward. Nothing. Why? Because they couldn't. Because they'd watched it happen in real time with their own tracking equipment, and they knew it was real. The official Soviet response to Apollo 11 was remarkably gracious. Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin sent a telegram to President Nixon. Please convey to the brave astronauts our congratulations and best wishes for a happy return to Earth. Pravda, the official Soviet state newspaper, covered the landing on the front page and treated it as a genuine achievement. Soviet scientists published technical analyses of the mission that treated it as real. Why would they do this if they had any doubt? Why would they concede defeat in the space race if they suspected it was faked? The answer is because they knew it wasn't faked. They'd monitored it themselves. Here's what makes this even more compelling. The Soviets had their own moon program that they were desperately trying to complete. The N-1 rocket, their equivalent of the Saturn V, went through 4 test launches between 1969 and 1972, and all 4 failed catastrophically, with some explosions being among the largest non-nuclear explosions in history. Their lunar lander program never got past testing phases. They tried with everything they had. They just couldn't make it work in time. If the moon landing was actually impossible, or if it was easily faked, the Soviets would have either succeeded themselves or exposed NASA's deception. Instead, they quietly abandoned their program, admitted defeat, and redirected their space efforts toward areas where they could compete successfully, like space stations where they actually did excel. The principle of Occam's razor applies here. The simplest explanation is usually correct. What's more likely, that NASA faked the moon landing with 1960s special effects technology, fooled every tracking station on Earth, including hostile foreign powers, fooled independent observatories, fooled the Soviets who were watching like hawks, maintained this lie perfectly for over 50 years, kept thousands upon thousands of people silent without a single credible whistleblower, or that America actually did land on the moon and the Soviets confirmed it because they watched it happen in real time with their own equipment. The second option is vastly simpler and requires far fewer assumptions. If the moon landing had been faked, someone would have talked by now. Not everyone can be bought. Not everyone can be threatened into silence. Not everyone would keep a secret for 50 years. In an era when Watergate was exposed by whistleblowers, when the Pentagon Papers were leaked, when MKUltra became public knowledge, when COINTELPRO was revealed, somehow nobody has come forward with credible evidence of the biggest hoax in human history. No deathbed confessions from elderly engineers, no leaked documents, no insider testimony? That doesn't make any sense if it was fake. The Soviet silence is deafening and definitive. The fact that America's greatest geopolitical enemy, the one with the most to gain from exposing a hoax, never challenged the moon landing's authenticity is the single strongest piece of evidence that it actually happened. Let's talk about the physical evidence that still exists today, evidence that anyone with the right equipment can verify for themselves. During Apollo 11, 14 and 15, astronauts placed retroreflector arrays on the lunar surface. These are panels covered with special corner cube prisms designed to reflect light directly back to its source, no matter what angle the light comes from. Here's how they work and why they matter. Scientists on Earth aim a powerful laser at the moon, specifically at the location where these retroreflectors were placed. The laser light travels to the moon, hits the retroreflector, and bounces straight back to Earth where sensitive detectors capture it. By measuring the time it takes for light to make the round trip, approximately 2.5 seconds, scientists can calculate the exact distance to the moon with millimeter-level precision. This experiment still works today. It's been working continuously since 1969. Observatories around the world, including facilities in the United States, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and other countries, regularly bounce lasers off these retroreflectors. Universities use them for research on lunar orbit dynamics, Earth rotation changes, and testing Einstein's theory of relativity. Some facilities do it just to demonstrate that it works. You absolutely cannot fake this. The retroreflectors are physically sitting on the moon at the exact coordinates where NASA said astronauts placed them over 50 years ago. If they weren't there, the lasers wouldn't bounce back, period. Some conspiracy theorists try to argue that maybe NASA sent unmanned probes to place the retroreflectors, so you don't actually need humans for that. While it's technically possible to land robotic missions on the moon, this argument falls apart under scrutiny. The retroreflectors are at the precise locations where NASA claims astronauts placed them. Apollo 11's is at Tranquility Base, Apollo 14's is at Fra Mauro, Apollo 15's is at Hadley Apennine. If NASA had faked the human landings but sent robots to place retroreflectors instead, why would those locations match the supposedly fake landing sites? Why not just publicly announce they were sending unmanned missions to place scientific instruments? And here's the bigger problem with this theory. If America had the technology in the 1960s to soft land robots on the moon with enough precision to deploy scientific equipment and then launch them back to Earth to return samples, which is an incredibly complex feat, then they definitely had the technology to send humans. At that point, sending humans is actually less complicated than developing fully autonomous robotic systems capable of those tasks with 1960s computer technology. Apollo missions brought back 842 pounds of lunar material across 6 different landing sites. These samples have been studied by thousands of scientists in dozens of countries for over half a century, and they are definitively, unquestionably, not from Earth. The evidence for this is overwhelming. First, the age. Moon rocks are between 3.2 and 4.6 billion years old. Earth rocks that ancient are extraordinarily rare because our planet's surface is constantly recycled through plate tectonics, volcanic activity, erosion, and weathering. Most of Earth's original surface is long gone. Second, the composition. Lunar samples contain minerals, isotope ratios, and chemical signatures that don't match anything found naturally on Earth. They formed in an environment completely different from Earth. Third, the absence of water. Moon rocks crystallized in an environment with no water and no free oxygen. Every rock that forms on Earth interacts with water at some point in its history, and you can see evidence of that in the rock's structure and chemistry. Lunar samples show no such evidence. Fourth, micrometeorite impacts. Lunar samples are covered in tiny pits and scars from micrometeorite bombardment. On Earth, our atmosphere burns up these tiny particles before they reach the surface. The Moon has no atmosphere, so its surface rocks accumulate this damage over billions of years. Fifth, cosmic ray exposure. Rocks on the lunar surface have been bombarded by cosmic rays for billions of years, creating distinctive isotope changes. Earth's atmosphere and magnetic field shield surface rocks from most cosmic radiation, so Earth rocks don't show these patterns. Some conspiracy theorists claim NASA could have just collected lunar meteorites from Antarctica, where they're relatively easy to find on the ice, and passed them off as moon rocks brought back by astronauts. But this argument has fatal problems. First, only about 200 pounds of lunar meteorite material has ever been found on Earth in total, and most of that was discovered decades after Apollo. The Apollo missions brought back 842 pounds of lunar material. Where did the other 640 pounds come from? Second, and this is the kicker, we actually know that certain meteorites found on Earth came from the Moon because their composition matches Apollo samples. So if NASA faked moon rocks using meteorites, where did those meteorites originally come from? It's circular logic that defeats itself. Third, NASA distributed moon rock samples to scientists and research institutions in dozens of countries, including the Soviet Union, China, and other nations that had no reason whatsoever to cover for America, and every reason to expose a fraud if they found one. Independent laboratories in these countries analysed the samples using their own equipment and confirmed they were genuine lunar material with properties that couldn't have come from Earth. If the rocks were fake, someone would have caught it. In 2009, NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter began photographing the Moon's surface in extremely high resolution. The images it captured show the Apollo landing sites in clear detail. You can see the descent stages of the lunar modules still sitting exactly where they were left, over 4 decades ago. You can see the rovers left behind by Apollo 15, 16, and 17. You can see the tracks left by astronauts walking on the surface. You can see the paths the rovers drove. These images are publicly available and anyone can examine them. Before conspiracy theorists say NASA faked these recent images too, remember that other countries have lunar orbiters. Japan's Kaguya probe photographed Apollo landing sites and confirmed the presence of hardware. China's Chang'e 2 orbiter imaged the Apollo sites from different angles. India's Chandrayaan missions have photographed the moon extensively. These space programs are operated by countries that compete with America in space exploration and technology. If the Apollo landing sites were fabricated in recent NASA images, these other countries would have contradicted those images with their own photography. They haven't, because the sites are real. You can doubt photographs from the 1960s. You can question video footage from 50 years ago. You can even choose not to trust NASA's word. But you cannot fake physical evidence that independent third parties from multiple countries can verify using their own equipment. The retroreflectors work, and anyone with a powerful enough laser and detector can test them. The moon rocks are genuine lunar material confirmed by scientists worldwide. The landing sites are visible from orbit to any nation with the capability to send a probe. All of this evidence points to one conclusion. Humans visited the moon between 1969 and 1972, and the physical proof of those visits is still there. Now let's address the claim that the moon landing footage looks fake, specifically that the astronauts moving around appears to have been done with wires like movie special effects. People point to the slow, floating movement and suggest it looks like Hollywood wire work, not real low gravity. But this argument reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of how both low gravity and wire rigs work. The moon's gravity is 1/6 of Earth's gravity. This creates very specific types of movement that are actually incredibly difficult to fake, especially with 1960s technology. When astronauts move on the moon, they don't float the way someone on wires would float. They move with a characteristic shuffling, bouncing gait because they still have mass and inertia, even though they weigh less. When they fall, which happens several times and the footage is available, they fall at 1/6 the speed they would on Earth, but they still fall in a realistic way. Their limbs move naturally. They struggle to regain balance. If they were on wires controlled by puppeteers, the movement would be too smooth, too controlled. Wire work in films requires careful choreography and multiple takes to look convincing, and even then it often looks somewhat unnatural because you're fighting against Earth's full gravity while trying to simulate something else. Here's the absolutely critical evidence that conspiracy theorists can never adequately explain: the dust. When the lunar rover drives across the moon's surface, when astronauts walk and kick up dust, that dust behaves in a very specific way. It flies up in perfect parabolic arcs, reaches a peak, and falls back down in smooth curves with absolutely no billowing, no swirling, no hanging in the air whatsoever. This is exactly how dust should behave in 1/6 gravity with no atmosphere. On Earth, dust behaves completely differently because of air resistance. When you kick dust on Earth, it swirls, it billows, particles drift and hang in the air because air is pushing against them from all directions. Even in controlled studio environments, you cannot eliminate this effect. In 1969, there was simply no way to fake this dust physics. Even with modern computer-generated imagery and particle simulation software, which didn't exist until the 1990s, getting dust physics correct is notoriously difficult. Visual effects artists will tell you that simulating realistic dust, water and smoke are among the hardest effects to create because the physics are so complex and any mistake is immediately obvious to the eye. Look at footage of the Apollo astronauts kicking up dust as they walk or drive. The dust sprays out in perfect arcs and falls immediately to the ground with no atmospheric interference, no particles hanging in the air, no swirling. This is physically impossible to fake on Earth without removing all the air And in 1969, they certainly didn't have a vacuum chamber large enough to film astronauts driving a rover around. Some conspiracy theorists suggest NASA filmed astronauts in regular Earth gravity and then slowed down the footage to mimic low-gravity movement. You can actually test this yourself. Record someone jumping or running on Earth and then slow down the playback to try to match what 1/6 gravity would look like. It doesn't work. It looks wrong because the physics are wrong. The acceleration curves are wrong. The way limbs move is wrong. The way fabric and equipment moves is wrong. And most importantly, dust still behaves like it's in Earth's atmosphere because it is. Professional video analysts and physicists have studied the Apollo footage frame by frame, and the physics is entirely consistent with 1/6 gravity in a vacuum, not slow-motion Earth gravity. The movement patterns, the fall rates, the way dust travels, all of it matches exactly what it should be on the Moon, and doesn't match what you'd get by filming on Earth and manipulating the footage. The technology to fake this convincingly simply did not exist in 1969. Some conspiracy theorists point to modern superhero films that use wire work and claim if they can do it now, surely NASA could have done it then. But modern wire work relies heavily on digital effects to erase the wires in post-production. In 1969, there was no digital post-production. There was no CGI. Film editing was done physically by cutting and splicing actual film. You couldn't seamlessly remove wires from footage. And even modern wire work doesn't look like the Apollo footage because the physics are different. When you watch Spider-Man swinging through the city on wires and CGI, it looks like movie physics, not real physics. The Apollo footage looks like real physics in low gravity. Let's consider the practical challenges of faking the moon landing with 1960s technology. The footage was broadcast live on television worldwide. Millions of people watched it as it happened. In 1969, video editing technology was extremely primitive. There was no digital video, no CGI, no way to composite footage in real time. Everything was analog. If NASA faked the footage, they would have needed to film it in advance, edit it perfectly with no mistakes, then broadcast it as if it were happening live while simultaneously coordinating it with real-time audio transmissions of astronauts talking to mission control. Those transmissions were being monitored by tracking stations around the world, including hostile nations. The time delay in the audio matches exactly what you'd expect for radio waves traveling to the moon and back, approximately 1.3 seconds each way. If the astronauts were actually in a studio on Earth pretending to be on the moon, there would be no time delay. Radio signals travel essentially instantaneously over short distances on Earth. The Soviets and independent tracking stations would have immediately noticed if there was no proper time delay in the communications. But the delay was there, precisely matching the distance to the moon. Think about the scale of the conspiracy that would be required. You'd need thousands of NASA engineers and technicians to be in on the fake. Hundreds of contractor companies building spacecraft components would have to know their work was for a fake mission. Astronauts who supposedly never went to space would have to maintain the lie for decades. Mission control staff watching fake telemetry would all have to be complicit. Tracking stations around the entire world reporting spacecraft position data would need to provide false information. Independent observatories that reported seeing the mission would have to be lying. Soviet intelligence, watching everything, would have to stay silent despite having every reason to expose it. Journalists covering the event would have to be part of the cover-up. Film crews creating fake footage would have to never talk about it. We're talking about tens of thousands of people, probably more, maintaining perfect secrecy about the biggest fraud in history for over half a century. No leaks, no deathbed confessions, no evidence, no whistleblowers. And remember, this was the era of Watergate, when a handful of people couldn't even keep a simple burglary covered up for a few months. The idea that tens of thousands of people kept a secret this massive for 50+ years strains credulity beyond the breaking point. Which is simpler and more likely, tens of nay. Thousands of people across multiple countries pulled off a perfect fake using 1960s technology with absolutely no leaks, no mistakes, and no contradictions, fooling every independent observer and every hostile foreign power, or NASA actually built the rockets that everyone watched launch, actually flew to the moon, and actually landed there? The second option is vastly simpler and requires far fewer assumptions. Stanley Kubrick's name comes up constantly in conspiracy theories because his 1968 film 2001: A Space Odyssey had groundbreaking special effects that convinced audiences they were watching real space travel. Some conspiracy theorists claim Kubrick was hired by NASA to direct fake moon landing footage. But this theory has massive problems. The space scenes in 2001 look realistic for their time because Kubrick used front projection, carefully designed sets, and meticulous lighting. But all of that only works in a controlled studio environment with artificial lighting and specific camera angles. The moon landing footage shows lighting and physics consistent with a single directional light source, like the sun, in an airless environment. Shadows are sharp with no diffusion. Light reflects off the lunar surface in very specific ways. Replicating this in a studio would require a light source as bright and as focused as the actual sun, positioned at exactly the right angle, with no atmospheric scattering effects. This was impossible in 1969 and is still extremely difficult today, even with modern lighting technology. More importantly, Kubrick's daughter Vivian has repeatedly and angrily debunked the theory that her father had anything to do with fake moon landing footage. She's called it a grotesque lie and pointed out that her father was a legendary perfectionist who would never have participated in such a deception. If anyone would know about Kubrick's involvement in a conspiracy of this magnitude, it would be his own family, and they've categorically denied it. So we arrive at the real conspiracy, the one that nobody talks about and that both sides of the moon landing debate tend to ignore. The conspiracy isn't that the moon landing was faked. The conspiracy is why we went in the first place and what it was really for. The moon landing was real. The physics checks out. The evidence is overwhelming. The testimony of thousands of witnesses and engineers is consistent. But here's what people miss. The Apollo program was never about science or exploration or advancing human knowledge. It was propaganda. It was a weapon, a psychological weapon in the Cold War. When President Kennedy announced in 1961 that America would land a man on the moon before the decade ended, that speech wasn't about expanding the frontiers of human knowledge. It was a direct response to America losing the space race to the Soviet Union. Yuri Gagarin had just become the first human in space weeks earlier, and it was a humiliating defeat for American prestige. Every Soviet space achievement was a propaganda victory that suggested Soviet technology was superior. Soviet scientists were smarter, Soviet education produced better results, and ultimately that communism was a better system than capitalism. In the context of the Cold War, where two superpowers with enough nuclear weapons to destroy civilization were locked in an ideological death struggle, this was terrifying to American policymakers. The space race was never about space. It was about demonstrating which political system was superior. Listen to Kennedy's famous speech at Rice University in 1962. He says, "We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other things, not because they are easy, but because they are hard." That sounds inspirational and noble. But keep listening to what he says next. Because that goal will serve to organize and measure the best of our energies and skills. Because that challenge is one that we are willing to accept, one we are unwilling to postpone, and one which we intend to win. Intend to win. Not intend to achieve or intend to accomplish. Intend to win. Win what? The space race. The Cold War. The battle for global ideological dominance. Apollo cost $280 billion in today's money. That's an absolutely insane amount of money for a program that had no economic return, no business case, no profit potential. But it was never about economics. It was about power. Think about how America spent money during the Cold War. $5 trillion on the Vietnam War, a war we ultimately lost. $500 billion on the Manhattan Project to build nuclear weapons. $280 billion on Apollo to beat the Soviets to the moon. None of these programs were about making money or improving American lives directly. They were about projecting power and winning ideological battles against communism. When Apollo 11 successfully landed on the moon and broadcast to 600 million people worldwide, the message was absolutely clear. America can do things the Soviet Union cannot. American technology is superior. American ingenuity is unmatched. American scientists and engineers are the best in the world. Capitalism wins. And that message was seen not just in America or allied countries, but in the Soviet Union itself, in China, in developing nations around the world that were deciding whether to align themselves with the United States or the USSR. That was the entire point of Apollo. It was a demonstration of power dressed up as scientific exploration. Soviet leadership understood exactly what Apollo represented. It wasn't a scientific mission, it was a power move, and they had no effective response to it. Their N-1 rocket kept exploding spectacularly. Their lunar lander program was failing. By 1970, they quietly abandoned their moon program and redirected resources to space stations and unmanned probes, areas where they could still compete. But the damage was done. America had decisively won the most public competition of the Cold War. After Apollo 11, NASA continued sending missions to the moon, not primarily because there was enormous scientific value, though there certainly was some, but because stopping would have looked like weakness or failure. If America had stopped after one successful landing, people might wonder if there was a problem, if it was too difficult to repeat, if something had gone wrong. So they went back 5 more times between 1969 and 1972, each landing reinforcing the same message. America can do this whenever we want, as many times as we want. Once the propaganda value was established and the Soviet Union had clearly lost the space race, there was no reason to continue the expensive program. That's why we haven't gone back in 50 years. Not because it was faked, not because we lost the capability, but because the political value disappeared. The Cold War ended. The Soviet Union collapsed. The entire reason for doing Apollo in the first place vanished. Governments don't fund programs that don't serve their interests, and once Apollo had served its purpose as a Cold War propaganda weapon, continuing it made no sense from a political standpoint. Here's the real lie that nobody acknowledges. NASA and the government sold Apollo to the public as one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind, as if it was about all of humanity reaching for the stars together. But it was actually one giant leap for America over the Soviet Union. It was about one country proving its dominance over another. The astronauts were genuine heroes who risked their lives, and the scientists and engineers who worked on Apollo were brilliant people doing incredible work, but they were all serving a propaganda purpose whether they fully understood it or not. This is the conspiracy that people should be talking about, not whether we went to the moon, but why we went and what it really meant. The moon landing represents a massive deployment of national resources and human talent, not to expand knowledge or explore for its own sake, but to win a political pissing contest with another superpower. That's the uncomfortable truth that gets buried under both the conspiracy theories and the patriotic mythology. And here's the kicker. We're watching it happen again right now. China is landing rovers on the moon and has announced plans for a permanent lunar base. India successfully landed near the lunar South Pole and is planning more missions. Private companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin are developing lunar landers and talking about moon colonies. NASA is developing the Artemis program to return humans to the moon. Why? Is it because humanity suddenly developed a renewed passion for lunar science? No, it's the same reason as before: power, prestige, and geopolitical competition. China wants to demonstrate it can rival American space capabilities. India wants to prove it's a major technological power worthy of respect. Private companies want to show that commercial industry can compete with government programs. It's not really about science or exploration, it's about who gets to control the narrative of human progress and technological achievement. The new space race is just a repeat of the old space race, with different players but the same underlying motivations. So yes, there was a conspiracy, just not the one people think. The conspiracy was wrapping a Cold War weapon in the language of scientific exploration and human achievement, making people believe it was about humanity's future among the stars, when it was really about America's dominance in the present. That's the lie that was told, and that's the lie that continues to be told. And unlike the moon landing itself, which definitely happened, this lie has never been fully acknowledged or confronted. The moon landing wasn't fake, but the reasons we were told for doing it were absolutely propaganda. This brings us to the final question. If the evidence for the moon landing is so strong, if the arguments against it fall apart under scrutiny, why does this conspiracy theory refuse to die? Why do millions of people still doubt it despite overwhelming proof? Because it's not really about the moon. When someone says, "I don't believe we went to the moon," what they're actually saying is, "I don't trust anything the government tells me." And after everything we discussed at the beginning of this video, Vietnam lies, Watergate, MKUltra, Tuskegee, COINTELPRO, NSA surveillance, weapons of mass destruction in Iraq that didn't exist, can you honestly blame people for being skeptical of official narratives? The moon landing skepticism is a symptom of a much deeper problem: the complete collapse of trust in institutions. Once you learn that powerful institutions lie regularly and get caught lying regularly, your brain starts seeing potential lies everywhere. Some of those suspicions are justified, many others are not. But the human brain doesn't always distinguish well between justified skepticism and paranoid conspiracy thinking. From a psychological standpoint, the moon landing hits every red flag that makes people suspicious. It happened during an era of massive government deception. It involved enormous amounts of money with unclear accountability. It served an obvious political purpose. The evidence, while real, seems almost too perfect. We did it 6 times and then never went back, which seems suspicious if you don't understand the political and economic context. And questioning the official story is socially discouraged, which to conspiracy theorists looks like suppression of truth rather than frustration with debunked claims. For someone already primed to distrust authority, the moon landing is the perfect conspiracy theory. There's also a powerful social and psychological dimension to conspiracy belief. Believing in conspiracy theories creates community and belonging. It makes you part of an in-group that knows the truth, while everyone else is asleep or brainwashed. This is psychologically rewarding, especially for people who feel powerless, marginalized, or unheard in their normal lives. Conspiracy theories provide secret knowledge that makes you feel smarter than experts and authorities. They give simple explanations for complex situations. The government is lying to us is much easier to understand than orbital mechanics, radiation physics, photography exposure settings, and Cold War geopolitics. The simpler explanation feels more accessible and therefore more true. The internet has massively amplified this effect. Before the internet, if you doubted the moon landing, you were isolated. You might mention it to a friend and they'd look at you like you were crazy, so you'd drop it. But now you can find thousands of people online who agree with you. You can watch hundreds of videos that claim to prove your point. You can join communities that reinforce your beliefs. Algorithms feed you more content similar to what you've already watched, creating filter bubbles. Dissenting views get dismissed as mainstream propaganda or paid shills. Before long, you're in an echo chamber where the moon landing hoax seems obviously true, and anyone who disagrees is either deceived or part of the cover-up. Here's the uncomfortable part. The people who doubt the moon landing aren't all stupid or crazy. Many of them are applying skepticism that would be healthy and appropriate in other contexts. They're right that governments lie. They're right that we should question official narratives. They're right that powerful institutions serve their own interests. They're just applying that skepticism to the wrong target, in this case. The moon landing is one of the most thoroughly documented and verified events in human history, with evidence that can be independently checked by anyone with the right equipment. But it gets lumped in with actual conspiracies and actual cover-ups because the institution behind it, the US government, has proven itself untrustworthy so many times. The moon landing has become a symbol, a proxy for arguing about institutional trust and authority. People don't really doubt we went to the moon so much as they doubt everything, and the moon landing is just the most dramatic example they can point to. When trust breaks down completely, everything becomes questionable. Every official story becomes suspect. Every piece of evidence becomes potentially fabricated. Every expert becomes potentially compromised. This is what happens when institutions destroy their own credibility through repeated lying and abuse of power. They create an environment where people can't tell the difference between legitimate events and actual conspiracies, between real threats and imaginary ones, between justified skepticism and paranoid delusion. The moon landing conspiracy theory is a symptom of trust collapse, not a rational evaluation of evidence. And that trust collapse is entirely the fault of the institutions that lied repeatedly and got caught. So here's where we end up. Yes, we really did land on the moon. The evidence is overwhelming and independently verifiable. The physics works. The Soviets confirmed it. The physical evidence is still there. The conspiracy theories fall apart under examination. But also, yes, there was a real conspiracy around Apollo, just not the one most people think. The real conspiracy was using the moon landing as a Cold War propaganda weapon while selling it to the public as pure scientific exploration. And yes, institutional trust has collapsed to the point where millions of people doubt even well-documented historical events, and that collapse is the fault of governments that have lied so consistently that people can no longer tell truth from fiction. The moon landing sits at the intersection of all these truths, which is why it remains one of the most debated events in history, despite being one of the best documented. We went to the moon. But we went for reasons that had nothing to do with what we were told, and in an era when every other thing the government said turned out to be a lie, it's not surprising that people doubt this one thing that happens to be true. That's the real story of the moon landing. Not whether it happened, but what it meant and why so many people can't believe it despite the evidence. The moon landing is real, the trust is gone, and that might be the biggest conspiracy of all.